Okay, today I'm going to be talking about the article by Ed Hewitt about, well, the question was, is Soviet socialism reformable? And at the beginning of the article, it kind of states that, this has been the question of all questions in the Soviet Union. And he used the term perestroika pessimism because things, didn't go that well at first, and there was a struggle with it. Gorbachev had made huge mistakes, and a lot of it was based on the idea of half-hearted reforms. Not being willing to just let go, but instead reforming a little bit over here and a little less over here, and um, leaving parts of the economy and parts of the population out, including parts of the population in. Um, as things went along, they started to began to understand more what things needed scrapped completely, would maybe be reformed, and we're hoping to use these lessons to really help out. But it felt like at that point, 5 years into Gorbachev, that it might have been too late. That public had experienced reform, and the experience was not a good one, and they had experienced Gorbachev's attempts at reform, and same situation. And part of in the article they talk about is that Gorbachev had um, no examples to follow. He himself, was writing the book as he goes. I mean, China had gone through some reforms, but they were different. And when Gorbachev was doing this, he's experimenting, and things are inevitably going to go bad in this major change. And what it comes about is the article comes to is um, looking at lots of different things, and we're going to get to that here in a minute. And but the first thing and the first question that was asked is, what are we transitioning to? Are we remaining a communist country politically, but becoming a free market, kind of along the example of China? Or no, that's not what we want to be. And the question was really wasn't answered, and that's a bad situation, because if you don't know where you're headed exactly, how the heck do you know how to get there and what steps need taking? But the article also acknowledged that, stating where we're going, it might not be a good thing either, because there are people who are going to push back. And if we are going too far, quote unquote, that politically it could be dangerous. And so that, maybe Gorbachev had more of an idea of where he was going, but was unwilling to state it. The article, though, believed that Gorbachev himself was uncertain, that that he really didn't know where this was all going completely, and that's part of the reason we had such issues. Okay, so how do we get from there to here, even though we might not know where here is? The first element is decentralization. It's the key. And one of the things that the Soviets did badly was they didn't take, this is according to the author of the article, was they took a halfway approach, and you can't do that. They economically, if you're going to do it, you have to do it. You have to give away decision making to those in the know, who know how many of some product to produce, or the improvements that consumers want to certain products. The state can't affect that because they don't have that information. One of the things that is dangerous is people can abuse that situation. Prices could become high. Even a criminal element can come in and have a bad effect. In order for this to work, decentralization, markets must be competitive. Foreign competition must be allowed. As a matter of fact, it's needed. And you need all the markets to be free. And he was very clear in the article that at first this is very difficult, and it leads to some bad times, and those bad times come with it. But there are bad times ahead when you first begin this, because this system, any major reform of a system like this is going to take time and have issues. Okay, the second point that he makes, property rights are important. Um, Owners have to, well, there have to be owners, number one, and those owners have to be able to use their property to their best advantage. The state cannot tell them what to do, and it has to allow them to develop their economics with their property. And this had been tried a little bit in the past, mostly with cooperative enterprises, and it had gone badly because they allowed cooperation, they allowed more freedom in, private property and private ownership of businesses, but they did not allow access to capital. They didn't necessarily allow access to the proper resources or help that happen or break down barriers for those owners to do that. There was very little foreign exchange allowed. So the tools that are necessary to make something like this work were denied them. And so these early cooperatives didn't do well. And they're trying to learn a lesson from this, but they may not quite be there yet, it was his point. The next question is, what are we going to do first? We're reforming a lot here, and we have a lot of segments. We have agriculture, we have manufacturing, we have technology, we have different segments of our economy. We also have political reforms. Are we going to do one sector and not the other? Are we going to do one at a time? Is there a plan? Are we going to open it all up? And they look at China. China started with agriculture, seemed to work for China because there's a short turnaround in growing season. There's already competitiveness built in because there are other producers in your own country. The resources are there. They exist on the farms already in the agricultural sector. The hope is, the goal by starting with agriculture is that more food was be available, more high quality food, more choices, cheaper. And the good thing about that would be that you would create enthusiasm. People would say, hey, look at what came out of agriculture. This is great. We have more food than we had. It's cheaper than food we had in the past. This is going well. So let's, I can't wait to see this happen in other, segments of our economy. In Russia, in the Soviet Union, they looked at it more of steps and looked more towards production of consumer goods as a place to do this. All right, the next question becomes how quickly to reform. Um, do you do it all overnight? Do you rip off the band-aid and let what happens happens? And in the case of economics, what the model says and what economists believe is you do it quickly. You don't want to delay. You want to let this happen and let the hard times happen and get through it to the other side. And you just have to do it. The problem is, when it came to politics and the politicians were needed for economic reform, they're very much against quick reform. They're worried it could cause a depression. And what they're really truly worried about it is it could cause the overthrow of the government, the end of the party, a lot of bad things that they don't want to see happen. So, there is an element of that where they're afraid of too quickly because they know what can come with it. And then there's gradual selective change. This goes back to what we talked about. Select, certain areas to change, certain areas will come later. Let's do this first, this second. But that leaves certain members of society out of the changes, some members of society in. And that could be a good or bad thing, depending how the changes are going. In general, it could be, it could be bad to leave certain segments out. All right. The fifth thing he came across was the role of politics and politicians. Political reforms must happen. And some of this had happened in the Soviet Union as democracy slowly takes hold, especially local officials and, kind of the old thinkers, people who were maybe still locked up in the past were pretty rapidly removed, so that you could, some use politics to push some of these older people out, which allows you to have new, younger, forward thinking people in it. But that may or may not work. There may be issues with that as well. In the end, the conclusion that he comes to is yes, that reforming could be a good thing, and that there should be the ability to reform, and it should work. The system could, but it acknowledges, and it's, as we know, it's true that it's not all perfect. It's not all peaches and cream along the way. There's some tough times, and those tough times are just part of a growing up process that could lead and should lead to better economics, more choices, better wages, overall, just a better economic system. And, the Soviets had been so stagnant during the 80s, and their economy so weak that, you almost needed to have something like this happen. Fundamentally major, if you want only, and it's tough to live with the growing pains. And I, to sit here and say, you know, oh, they should have just, sucked it up, and oh well, things were bad, and goods weren't available, and jobs weren't available, and corruption was rampant, and organized crime was terrible. Well, it's easy for us to sit here and say, well, you should have just taken it. But I mean, that's difficult, to leave a position of relative stability, if stagnant, still stable, and go to a brand new system that by all outward appearances seems to be failing. And so I can see why things, were rough at first, and why um, a man like Vladimir Putin could use the general situation in Russia to improve his position politically.